This radio show curates Japanese anime culture and economy. TORO Animation Research.
From essential recommendations to obscure trivia, this is Ryota Fujitsu's Anime Lab.
During this segment, we'll have Chief Researcher Ryota Fujitsu randomly introduce historically significant anime and present column-style discussions on anime-related topics. We look forward to your insights. Thank you for joining us.
Today, since our theme is anime based on shojo manga, I thought I'd introduce some epoch-making works in the history of shojo manga adaptations. First, I think it's important to establish when the category or genre of shoujo manga actually emerged.
When was that, I wonder?
Roughly speaking, around the mid-1950s. Obviously, magazines for young girls had existed before then. There were what we called girls' magazines, which contained a mixture of articles, written content, illustrated stories, fashion information, and so on, with manga also being featured during certain periods. As the overall popularity of manga gradually increased throughout the 1950s, and as children's manga gained wider appeal, magazines like Nakayoshi and Ribbon began to establish themselves. Around the mid-1950s, specifically the mid-1950s, this is generally considered the period when girls' manga was established as a distinct genre. One of the epoch-making works was Sally the Witch, which began broadcasting in 1966.
Wow!
This was based on Mitsuteru Yokoyama's original work, serialized in Ribbon magazine. What made it groundbreaking was that it was the first anime explicitly described as created for girls in its planning documents.
It said in the proposal that this is what they were aiming for.
I see. The main target. But of course, this is obvious, but statistically speaking, it's almost a 50-50 split between males and females, right? And yet, until then, children were just roughly lumped together in one category called kids. So it was decided that we should properly recognize girls as a distinct segment. But since this was the first attempt, there were some safety measures written in, like including elements of family-oriented content or adding more gag scenes and comic relief to make it a bit more fun. However, the primary stated goal was to create something for girls based on Mitsuru Yokoyama's original work that was published in a girls' manga magazine, so that's essentially the origin point. By the way, there's also Princess Knight. Whenever I talk about this, people from a certain generation always point out, wasn't Osamu Tezuka's Princess Knight created first?
Anticipating the counter-argument, aren't we?
From your perspective, this might be a story from before your parents were even born, but just to clarify, Princess Knight was serialized during the very early establishment and popularity of shoujo manga in the girls' magazine Shoujo Club. It was the first of its kind, and then in the early 1960s it was remade and serialized again in Nakayoshi magazine. This was animated in 1967 after Sally the Witch. So the thinking was, if Sally could work, then this should work too. Obviously, that was the progression, which is why Sally the Witch is considered the first anime based on a shoujo manga aimed at girls.
It was truly groundbreaking, ahead of its time.
So that's how it works. Now, about those historically significant hit works. Candy Candy, which began broadcasting in 1976.
I'm embarrassed to say this is the first time I've heard about it.
I see, this was a huge hit. You could say it was one of the iconic faces of the Showa era that took the country by storm. The story is set mainly in America and Britain. It's about a girl named Candy who grew up in an orphanage in America, and even at 12 years old, no one had come to adopt her. Then one day, when she finally thought she had found a home, it turned out she was just being brought in as a companion to the children of the wealthy Ligon family. So she wasn't actually adopted, she was just meant to be a playmate for the children. But when she arrived, the siblings there were incredibly mean and bullied her terribly. That's how it starts, but then by coincidence she ends up being adopted by the Adley family, who are even wealthier than the Ligons, and from there she begins to walk her own path in life. Roughly speaking, it's like a combination of Daddy Longlegs and Gone with the Wind. It's like a story that combines the famous Daddy Longlegs with Gone with the Wind. The reason for the Gone with the Wind comparison is that there's a war in the middle and in the latter half, specifically the First World War period. The story is set in the early 20th century, so that's the time frame. The war has a significant impact and there are two men the protagonist falls for. The first is a model student, while the second is a bad boy. This is the classic Gone with the Wind pattern. It's a truly classic storytelling formula.
The classic way.
So this was a collaboration between two creators, Kyoko Mizuki and Yumiko Igarashi. It was a partnership where Mizuki provided the text-based original story and Igarashi did the illustrations. The series became a massive hit. How big was it? By the time the final volume, the 7th book, was released, it had already sold over 10 million copies.
Volume 7 will be the final volume, I see.
Yeah, that's right. It was really short back then. Just 7 volumes for a monthly magazine series. And the theme song performed by Mitsuko Hori became a huge hit. Back then, it was categorized in what they called the TV cartoon children's song division. You know, this was during a time when there wasn't even a consumption tax.
Back when there wasn't a consumption tax yet, right?
Yeah, children's records were tax exempt by being classified as for children. They were tax-free products. They weren't subject to the commodity tax. This is somewhat related to the tax system, which is why there was a separate category for TV cartoon children's song. This category topped the charts 2 years in a row in terms of sales.
Amazing.
It was a huge hit with such a dramatic storyline that even the theme song became a massive success. However, due to various issues, particularly disputes between copyright holders and original authors, it's currently unavailable for viewing and the printed volumes haven't been renewed. This has been the case for about a quarter century now. As a result, it's become rather difficult for the series to transcend generations.
It's definitely a huge hit, but it's no wonder we haven't heard of it.
It's become something like a legend, hasn't it?
The scale of its success was incredibly massive. It might sound strange to say recently, but there's even talk that Toei's Ashita no Naja was consciously created as a remake of Candy Candy. That series is also set in Europe and tells the story of an orphaned girl who perseveres through life's challenges. Anyway, Candy Candy is truly fascinating, so if you happen to find the volumes at a used bookstore, I highly recommend picking them up. I think you'll be deeply moved by its dramatic storyline and the perfectly executed elements that make it a quintessential shojo manga.
I'm curious about that.
Well, this was a huge hit too, but to put it another way, while it was a big hit, it actually became too successful. There was no follow-up project that came after it. For example, when Sally the Witch was created, Toei continued to make stories about girls who use magic. After Candy Candy became a hit, they created Magic Girl Lalabelle, which featured a girl traveling through Europe, or hello, Sandy Bell, which was about the everyday life of an energetic girl who doesn't use magic. While Lalabelle was relatively successful, it couldn't match Candy Candy's massive popularity. Plus, Candy Candy had such high originality that it was difficult to imitate its format.
Is this something you're looking forward to seeing remade?
I think everyone would like to do remakes if they could, to be honest, but there are rights holder issues to consider.
Everyone thinks that, right?
I'm sure there are people who think if they could make Slam Dunk, there's no way they couldn't do this. So this is something that can't happen without the agreement of all parties involved, so it's a project we'll have to look forward to in the future, but it was also very significant. Another major influence was Sailor Moon. It began airing in 1992, and it was based on Naoko Takeuchi's manga serialized in Nakayoshi magazine. Toei has a long history of collaborating with publishers and manga artists to develop projects. They worked with Go Nagai on Devilman and Mazinger Z. The process involves sitting down with manga artists, discussing ideas like, what do you think of this concept, brainstorming together, and then saying, we'll produce the anime based on this idea and you create the manga. That's how the system works. Before Sailor Moon, there was a story with the codename Sailor V, which featured Sailor Venus as the protagonist.
Radio name Kiyoshi writes in, after watching Codename Sailor V, I switched to cheering for Minako Aino instead. I used to love Sailor Mars, but I guess I was pretty fickle back in high school.
I totally get how you feel, I really do. Minako Aino, both her name and her character's personality, she kind of has that main protagonist vibe, you know? That's actually what led to the birth of Sailor Moon. They took that concept and said, hey, let's develop this into an anime project. It was really the combination of Toei's planning skills and Ms. Takeuchi's sensibility. Using names of gemstones and stars, that stylish approach obviously contributed to its massive success. But what was truly remarkable here is that after this, girls transforming and fighting became a standard trope. Before that, magic was typically portrayed as something that either solved everyday problems or conversely caused trouble in daily life. But Sailor Moon created this zone where coolness and cuteness merged together. This is what they call the Ophiben of cool and cute, right? The greatest innovation of Sailor Moon was implementing this concept, which then directly led to Pretty Cure.
That's certainly true.
So I really do think this was a groundbreaking work after all.
Mr. Fujitsu, we have a message about Sailor Moon from radio name Masuda-san that brings up an interesting point, so I'd like to share it. I always thought Usagi Tsukino, the main character, was far from being leadership material. However, recent leadership theories suggest that a true leader isn't someone who just says, "Follow me," but rather someone who places team members in positions that suit their abilities and motivates them. The fact that Sailor Moon was practicing this 30 years ago is truly admirable. That was a fresh perspective from Masuda-san.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Usagi-chan is basically written as a silly character, but she's the type who, precisely because of her silliness, can see through to the essence of things. There's something like a spiritual training in goodness about her. In that sense, Usagi-chan ultimately represents acceptance. I mean, she develops in the direction of someone who doesn't reject others and possesses this enormous maternal instinct, which is probably the key point about her. She's not about being the strongest or the smartest, Looking back at history, I think these three stand out as significant anime adaptations of shoujo manga. But if I were to mention my personal favorite shoujo manga adaptation, and this is quite obscure, so I won't go into much detail, since I absolutely love Keiko Takemiya's work, there's The Door to Summer. While there's a famous SF novel with the same title, this is Takemiya's story about boys at a French boarding school during one summer. It was adapted into anime in 1981, and it's absolutely brilliant. Another one would be Takemiya's masterpiece, The Song of Wind and Trees. This is also set in a French boarding school and, well, at the time, using the terminology of that era, it depicted the love between two characters, a dark-skinned boy born to a gypsy mother and a character named Gilbert who suffered from neglect and controlling violent affection. It portrays a world of boys' love. Yoshikazu Yasuhiko adapted this into an anime, and it's truly a masterpiece. However, it hasn't been released on DVD or Blu-ray yet, so after renting it, I ended up buying it on Laserdisc. It's exceptionally well made, and I'll conclude by simply saying that I love this work.
Thank you, Mr. Fujitsu. How did you enjoy this episode of SBS Radio's TORO Animation Institute? TORO Ani is broadcast live every Monday at 7 p.m. on Japan's SBS Radio. Please be sure to tune in. This has been Ryota Aoki, host of SBS Radio's TORO Animation Institute.